Next up is Heather Caldwell, who's an associate professor in the Department of Biological Sciences and has also served as the graduate coordinator there. She's a faculty member also in the School of Biomedical Sciences. Her work's focused on understanding the neural underpinnings of social behaviors and neuropsychiatric disorders, which focus on the contributions of oxytocin and vasopressin. She received her BA and MS degrees in biology from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro and her PhD from Georgia State University. She completed her postdoctoral training at the National Institute of Mental Health and joined Kent State in 2007. Since then, she's received the Distinguished Advisor Award and is the current president of the local chapter of the Society for Neuroscience. Her lab is supported by a grant from NSF, but she's been previously supported by grants from the NIH also. She's on the editorial board of Hormones and Behavior and regularly serves as a grant reviewer for the Biotechnology Biological Sciences Research Council, NSF, and NIH, and recently finished a 2-year appointment as chair of the NIH Fellowship Study Section. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Caldwell.
Okay, so thank you all for having me. So I was told I'm supposed to keep it for a general audience, but I have to warn you, there are a few graphs in here, but I will walk you through them. So my scientific interests are really about the neuroendocrine regulation of social behavior. So how hormones in your brain may modify the way that you behave in specific types of social contexts. And so I think the first thing to think about is what exactly is a hormone and how essentially are they going to work, right? So these are chemicals. They are going to affect lots of ways that our body works. We often think about what they're doing out in the periphery. For instance, thinking about the estrogens and the androgens made in the ovaries and the testes, for example. Many of us have had children, or we've all been through puberty, so that's the one that people most obviously gravitate towards. But there are a number of neurochemicals, neurotransmitters, neurohormones in your brain that are constantly shifting and basically resulting in subtle alterations in your behavior, okay? And so the main thing that I want you, if nothing else, right, if you're just snoozing for the rest of my talk, is to keep in mind that hormones do not cause behavior to happen, okay? I can't inject myself with testosterone and all of a sudden I'm going to go around and hit people, okay? It's not that testosterone equals aggression, okay? That is not the case. In fact, hormones are there. They're kind of that milieu that's circulating in our body and our physiology that are going to increase or decrease the likelihood that a behavior may occur in a specific type of social context, okay? So you need that there for behaviors to occur, but they're not causal, okay? So we're not usually thinking that you just, all of a sudden you just have a, neurotransmitter release and then all of a sudden you just go off and, do something that's out of context, because that context piece becomes really critical. Okay, so I think one of the things to think about, right, is being social for species that are social, including most humans, not all. Most of us find social interactions rewarding. The degree to which we might find social interactions rewarding are going to differ, right? Whether you're more an extrovert versus a more introvert personality and kind of things that sit in between. But in general, being social has rewards. And from an evolutionary standpoint, it makes sense that animals, at least certain times of the year, right, are going to need to be able to be social with one another. Otherwise, none of us would be here, nor would all of the other species that are here that continue to persist. And so there are a number of different types of chemicals that are involved in kind of the underpinnings of what it is to be social. The first one is the dopamine system. So lots of times we think about dopamine with drug abuse because that's what's really turned on with drug abuse, but it's also what's turned on when you're having a positive reciprocal interaction with one another. You think about endogenous opioids. So those are the ones that you make yourself, right? Not the ones that you take. And those are also released under these positive interactions as well. So they're reinforcing those types of behaviors. And then we have, like, for instance, serotonin. So you might be familiar with serotonin if we think about serotonin reuptake inhibitors, such as Prozac, for instance, right? And so we know that that's associated with changes in mood, like depressive-like behaviors. So those are some of the major players for attachment. But one of the others is a neuromodulator called oxytocin. And so this is in the periphery, it's associated with milk ejection. It literally means sharp birth. But in the brain, it acts more as kind of a classical neurotransmitter, and is kind of the thing that I always think about is like the glue. It's that extra little piece that's going to be really important when it's released at very specific parts of your brain. So you might be familiar with it. It's called the love hormone or the cuddle hormone sometimes. But again, it's not, if only it was as simple as giving everyone oxytocin and we all just walked around like, yeah, you're great, life is great, right? That's ecstasy, and that is not oxytocin. So oxytocin does not work in that fashion. Again, it's modulatory in nature. So one of the cool things about oxytocin, at least from my perspective, is the fact that it is found across phyla. So you see oxytocin or some version of it as we move through all different types of species. And it turns out that not only is some version of it in all these different types of species, but what it does within those species is actually somewhat similar, and it's always associated with these kind of social behaviors. So it's species specific, right? Because what a nematode does to be social is not the same thing that a human does to be social, but it's still like got that social piece to it, which is really neat. And there's actually more recent work that has is getting to like the structure of oxytocin. There are these like subtle shifts in certain primate species, which are actually, it's an interesting area of research as well. So when we think about oxytocin, what it does, we're thinking about these affiliative behaviors, bringing animals together. We're thinking about sex. We're thinking about being a parent. We're thinking about being aggressive, right? Being aggressive is an important part of being social, right? Maybe you need to defend your offspring or your territory, for instance. We think about anxiety. We think about energy homeostasis. Sorry, I put nociception pain up here as well. And then actually also with ethanol consumption. And then it's acting and interacting with a variety of other systems as well. Okay, so it's a complicated, wonderful system that's going to allow animals to do what they need to do. So it turns out that there's only really one type of oxytocin receptor. So the oxytocin receptor that's in the uterus is of the same structure as the receptors that are actually in the brain as well. And this is the case for humans as well as other species. And just to orient you, this is called a sagittal section. Okay, so this is like if I take my own head, I won't split open your guys' heads, I'll just do my own. And I split it open like a watermelon. If I do that and I look into the side, that would be my sagittal section. So this is a mouse, otherwise everything would be tucked under if it was human, right? So we've got like the olfactory bulb up here, and back here is the cerebellum, really important for movement. And what I'd like to just point out is ignore all the abbreviations, like it doesn't matter. But essentially there are all these places all over the brain where we have lots of oxytocin receptors that can be found. And it turns out that the places where those receptors are found are in the parts of the brain that are called the SBNN. So that's the social behavior neural network. And it's through like the interconnectivity of these different nodes where oxytocin is acting, as well as a variety of other neurotransmitters and other neurohormones are interacting dynamically to shift the output, presumably, of this whole system. So it's really exciting to think about those modulations and how you get these types of motivated behaviors that animals have to do in order to be able to survive. So I thought I'd spend a few minutes getting a little sciencey, talking about what we actually do in my laboratory. So I don't study people. I'm more of a bench scientist, foundational work, looking at neurochemistry. So it turns out doing neurochemistry in people is really hard. It's unethical. They don't let us punch things out of your head and put things in typically. So one of the things that's really nice about rodents, for instance, is that a lot of the core behaviors that rodents engage in, they're pretty social. They like to hang out with each other. They can be really aggressive. Those base behaviors, those motivated behaviors are actually very similar between mice and humans in terms of the basic neurochemistry. And so we can dissect some of that by using rodent species. So this is my lab. For some reason we have all women right now, which given it's oxytocin seems appropriate. Essentially we have one of my students that's looking at neural underpinnings of maternal behavior, because there are wonderful stories about oxytocin is important for milk ejection, and it's also important for mother-infant bonding. we have a student looking at oxytocin and its association with schizophrenia. So there's evidence that oxytocin can act as a natural antipsychotic, and so we're trying to understand that, which it's hard to ask a mouse if it's schizophrenic, so we have to do some interesting things to try to get it in a schizophrenic-like state. We are looking at, this is like our big project right now, looking at oxytocin in development. Usually we're thinking about it in adulthood, but myself and some other folks around the world think that it's actually important for the development of the social brain. And so we're trying to get at what does that mean in structure and in changes in the brain. And then we actually have this weird project that's been in Manitoba, and I have a student that is manipulating behavior in the field in ground squirrels and is actually looking at a different sister hormone to oxytocin, that would be vasopressin. So a little bit of data. So for instance, when we think about maternal behavior, it turns out that if you don't have the receptors for oxytocin, that you're a pretty bad mom most of the time, and that you kill your offspring. And so that's what we see here. So we've got the number, essentially percentage of dams that kill their offspring, and if everything is normal, not many of them kill their offspring, but when they're missing kind of that oxytocin signaling piece, we get about 67% that will kill them. Okay, and it turns out that oxytocin is really important for lowering the threshold for the initiation of maternal care. It turns out when you don't have normal oxytocin, that your social memory is very strange. Okay, so animals have to be able to remember that they've met someone else before. Humans, other primates, use the visual system primarily for that. But when we look at rodents, that's an olfactory-based system. And it turns out that essentially, if you're missing oxytocin receptors, you have a form of social amnesia. You meet an animal, and then you meet it again, and you don't remember having met it the first time. And so that's kind of what we see here. So we have the difference here, essentially, between this is our normal animal, and this means that it recognizes it, and that is absent here in our knockout mouse. And it turns out when you don't have oxytocin receptors, you actually become more aggressive as well. So the way that we look at that is what's called a latency to attack, how long it takes to attack. And so if it's shorter, that means they're more aggressive. And they also show like an increases in aggressive behavior. So that oxytocin signaling seems to be important for that as well. I mentioned we're looking at development. So we hypothesize that there's actually a fetal story for oxytocin, that this may come from the mother, that the maternal oxytocin may be crossing and entering the developing fetus, and may ultimately change the way that kind of that social brain is actually developing in that fetus. That sets a trajectory for their lifetime. So we have started to look at that, and essentially, not only is there an oxytocin system that's present in fetal life, but it's different between males and females. Essentially, the female system seems a little bit more amped up than the male system, so they're the line here on top, those are females. And then the male system, there are some interesting things in terms of kind of the onset of the receptors and the availability of the actually oxytocin part, with the receptors being present, but the ligand, the oxytocin piece isn't there yet. And so we think that's one of the reasons that maybe mom could be providing it, or there could be something else that's signaling, because it doesn't make sense for there to be a receptor and then nothing to activate it when they're off by several days from one another. So we're taking a look at that as well. And this is really exciting, because sex differences is always a good place to be. So I just wanted to show you what this would look like. So this is actually, these are coronal sections. So rather than the splitting like a watermelon, this time we're slicing like a loaf of bread. And then we're looking in, this is a fetal brain. They're pretty underdeveloped and tiny. All of this purple is like a stain for the cell bodies, essentially. And then over here, where you see these fuzzy, weird, dark things, those are the oxytocin receptors that are there. And that's using a radioligand that labels the receptors. And so we see a little bit of signal here, and here. And then we see a little signal here. Okay? So this signal is in a part of the brain that's really important for like cell proliferation. It's like the fountain of cells. Okay, it's called the ventricular and subventricular zones. And then here, that is in what's called the amygdala. And the amygdala is like the emotional brain. So when you think about fear memory, for instance, like that is like ground in the amygdala. And so we see that in there as well. And that when we think about aggressive behavior, the amygdala is actually really important. So the fact that there's a signal there in development, we might be able to change the way that part of the brain actually forms, could potentially kick off those events that shift aggressive behavior later in life. So we're taking a look at that. And in fact, we have preliminary data that shows that if we mess with that oxytocin signaling while they're developing as a fetus, that we can change their trajectory for aggressive behavior, for instance. And we think that's not specific to aggressive behavior. So it turns out that we can actually make them more aggressive. Okay? So oxytocin, important thing, glue of social bonds. Hormones don't cause behavior to happen. They just increase or decrease that probability. And that is my story. Thank you. Yes.
So is anything understood about the mechanism? So once oxytocin reaches an oxytocin receptor, then what happens?
That's an excellent question. So, like for instance, they know that in certain brain regions, like one region would be the nucleus accumbens, for instance. That's a part that's really important for the reward system. That there's a convergence there of oxytocin signaling as well as like dopamine signaling, and those tend to be on cells that make glutamate, for instance. And so that is going to send off kind of an excitatory volley through some of these nodes in the brain. But it's really been only recently that scientists have been able to, so most of the time we just inject things in specific parts of the brain and then we see what happens, which is great, but it doesn't tell you about the complex interactions between specific nuclei in the brain and kind of what's going on electrically. So in the past 10 years there's been this beautiful work where they go in and they'll optogenetically stimulate firing, which is also great. But it doesn't tell you always, it's getting better, about the specific receptor to the next step neurotransmitter piece. And so those are the pieces that are now kind of being dissected out. So the quick answer to your question is no, we don't understand it very well. We understand it better in some brain areas as opposed to other brain areas. I think we're getting better at it, but I think that it's difficult and we have a long way to go. Yeah. Anything else? Yes.
So are there oxytocin receptor blockers that are used for some purposes? Are they used clinically? Or?
No. So the big clinical extravaganza of the last decade has been intranasal oxytocin administration. And so we don't typically give oxytocin receptor antagonists because you end up with kind of all these unfortunate deleterious effects. But intranasal oxytocin has been a really big area and it's been used at, there are just tons of, everyone got on the bandwagon for in the last few years. Like, I feel like every psychiatrist has tried
so it's
oxytocin.
What is it?
So it's been used in a variety of contexts. The idea is, so in the context of marriage therapy, for instance, that you would squirt some up your nose and then you go and you sit and talk with a therapist and that it might make you a little more open to the interaction, with your spouse, for instance. They've used it as an adjunctive therapy to antipsychotics and schizophrenics.
The people who already knew that.
Right, and they've used it so in schizophrenia, they've used it as an adjunctive therapy to try to help bring back some of the flatten affect, to help with some of the negative symptoms of schizophrenia that are not addressed with typical antipsychotics. There's evidence that you can tweak and maybe make things a little more pro-social. There are wonderful things looking at, in the prisoner's dilemma kind of thing, with betting, that you can make people more trusting, essentially, with intranasal oxytocin. But there have been some significant issues associated with that. The first is that it's really unclear how well it crosses the blood-brain barrier, and then kind of that, if it is, you're thinking about metabolism, that's probably less than 10 minutes in central nervous system tissue, and then how far is it actually diffusing and getting to where it needs to go? Maybe it's setting off a secondary release of oxytocin. We don't know. And maybe it's just getting into some parts of the brain, but what does that mean? And so I think the long-term efficacy has really been questioned. The other piece of that is it's not always a pro-social hormone. It depends on the specific social context and specifically where it's released in the brain, and it also depends on the person's individual life history. And so people, for instance, when they've given it to individuals like borderline personality disorder, it actually makes things worse for them, and that's because they fall on a line of social behavior that is quite different than kind of your typical human. So that context piece seems to be really important. So from a therapeutic standpoint, I don't think there's going to be anytime soon like a great windfall for oxytocin unless we have a means by which to deliver it into specific parts of the brain with a high level of control, and that is elusive for us. Yes?
Heather, we know that estrogen is involved in learning and memory, and I never thought about this before. Do you have any evidence?
Most of it centers around more vasopressin and learning memory. So the learning memory components with oxytocin are centered around those social memory pieces. So like that social memory task, and those tend to be more amygdala based and less on the hippocampus side of things. So yes, there's a story. It's just not kind of in the same domain that I think you're thinking about. But certainly there's a beautiful rich history between the estrogens and oxytocin in terms of like oxytocin increasing like estrogen receptors. And so there's beautiful work with like estrogen receptor beta, for instance, in the oxytocin system. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.